Hello, and welcome back to Uncodified. In today's episode, the barons get jealous of Piers Gaveston, Thomas of Lancaster struggles at government, and Queen Isabella finds out her husband is gay.
After this, we look at the good parliament, the bad parliament, the wonderful parliament, the merciless parliament, and the fabulous parliament. One of these he made up. Which do you think it is? We beg your forgiveness for not covering the wars in Scotland and the Black Death, or the Hundred Years' War, or the Peasants' Revolt. We are constitution focused and will be following a relationship between Parliament and the King. These topics are covered more than enough elsewhere.
And also, don't forget to like and subscribe because we need it, we feed on it, and we are hungry. And now to the episode. At first glance, Edward II's reign is characterised by opposition to his favourites Piers Gaveston and the Despensers by the barons and their attempts to curtail him. But underneath this is an explosion of constitutional experimentation and some other kinds of experimentation. If you history buffs, you might know. The events in the reign of Edward II that are important into the development of the relation between king and parliament are, thusly, his coronation oath in 1308, the Lords' Ordinances in 1311, and the Statute of York, and most importantly, his eventual deposition.
The coronation oath was noticeable in two ways. Firstly, it was spoken in French rather than Latin. And second, it contained an additional line to uphold the laws of Edward the Confessor and the laws and rightful customs which the community of the realm shall have chosen. This did not expand the king's obedience to the law much further than where Braxton had left it, but it was significant as it binded Edward II to laws passed in his reign in a way that his father wasn't, and it became the method by which the barons would restrain the king throughout his reign.
In the February Parliament of 1310, the Earls of Gloucester, Richmond, and Surrey turned up, locked and loaded, claiming that Edward had been led by evil councillors, Gaveston in question, to wasting funds granted by previous governments, and giving up too easily in Scotland against Robert the Bruce, who was at this time proving to be a bit of a menace. In response, the king agreed in March to the appointment of 21 ordainers with the power to reform the realm and his household as a one-off.
So the ordinances in August which were produced in August, were wide-ranging and included provisions managing the king's finances, separating them from the kingdom, preventing the king from using customs duties to pay back debts of Italian banks, which is something Edward I had relied on to finance the war in Scotland, and taxation went directly to the exchequer rather than the king's household. Just to emphasise this, the debt is excessive. Edward I owed £60,000, which is enough to buy 70,588 horses at the time.
It also restricted the king's ability to go to war without first consulting Parliament, or to appoint officers of state or members of his household without consulting the barons. The ability to appoint sheriffs was given to ministers and council rather than directly by the king. The ordinances also created the office of the Keeper of the Seal to restrain the king from acting unanimously.
In terms of the impact that the ordinance had on the courts, we've already mentioned one clause which required the king to hold parliament up to twice a year to hear petitions in its role as a court in our medieval judiciary episode. The ordinances also criticised the king for using the office of the Privy Seal to impede the common law. Another monumental factor is the ordinances granted Parliament a form of judicial oversight by requiring that appointments of the Chief Justices of the King's Bench and the Court of Common Pleas, along with subordinate judges, were to be made by the council and assent of the baronage of Parliament.
Now, our modern Parliament doesn't practice judicial oversight in quite the same way. They have ability to remove judges if both houses agree, but not a vote on the appointment of judges. But the Americans do. The chief executive nominates a judge, and that judge is scrutinized and voted on by the upper house. Clause 9 forbid the king from leaving England without the consent of the baronage and Parliament, meaning that the king could not travel to Ireland or Gascony, where he is also king, without first consulting Parliament.
Now, we move on to a potential civil war. Again, because this happens all the time, apparently. The king did not take the ordinances sitting down, and in January 1312, he moved his government to York and made overtures to the Chancery and the Exchequer, and like Dodd when faced with baronial opposition, he appealed to the Pope. He also produced writs to restore Gaveston to his lands and titles.
He also used a loophole in the ordinances to reappoint Langston, his former treasury. He then banned the barons from assembling but allowed them into London so long as they were unarmed. They met at St. Paul's where the bishops were already waiting for them. On the 13th March, this baronial council deputized 3 barons to stop Langston taking his office, divvied up wardenship of different regions of England, and plotted to capture Gaveston. Gaveston was executed by the coalition of barons on the 19th of June after having been captured following a siege at Scarborough.
The power struggle between the barons and the king would continue to dominate Parliament for the next 10 years. In the 1313 Parliament, negotiations took place to gain pardons for the murder of Gaveston. In 1314, after Robert the Bruce's victories in Scotland, Edward finally agreed to the ordinances, which were reaffirmed each for the following 2 years, giving significant power to the leader of the barons, Thomas of Lancaster, who was coincidentally the king's cousin.
Haynes quotes Conway Davies. No matter touching the king or the kingdom was to be undertaken without the assent of the earl and the other prelates, earls, and barons. The king was to have no independence of action. The council, with Lancaster at its head, was to assent to every administrative act before it was undertaken.
It was agreed at the January-February 1316 Parliament that the barons of the council were responsible to Parliament, and that if any prelate or secular noble, apparently the bishops get away with anything, were to advise the king or act in a way which was detrimental to the king or kingdom, he would be removed in the next Parliament. This is very similar to the constitution of the Montfortian Parliament, and it really suggests ministerial responsibility to Parliament. It is surprisingly close to the constitutional arrangement you might expect to see in the 1700s, at least on its surface.
Despite this overarching powers, Taub believes that Lancaster was mostly ineffective at enforcing the ordinances between February 1316 and the summer of 1318. He refused to allow the king to conduct business without Parliament, but then didn't turn up when they were called, and by September 1317, both the king and the earl were sitting castles in Yorkshire raising men.
Civil war was only narrowly avoided through the Treaty of Leek, which maintained the ordinances. Lancaster's faction would receive a pardon, Parliament would be summoned, and a council appointed by Lancaster would remain with the king. If the king and this council went beyond the powers of the king himself, as opposed to those of the king and Parliament, its acts could be annulled in the next Parliament. The executive power was transferred to a baronial committee, and this committee was formed from and responsible to Parliament. This really does have echoes in our modern constitution.
The political machinations of this period are very fascinating and exciting, actually, so it'll be a real pity to miss it, which we will do. So go read a book, and you can find those books in the bibliography below. Between 1318 and 1321, the conflict regained strength around the king's new favourite, the Despensers, where the earls and barons formally tried and banished them without the king's agreement. Due to another brief civil war, which unfortunately happened quite a lot, we also unfortunately don't have time to go into, the king seized back control of the country by March 1322, and the number of the chief earls, including Lancaster, died either on the battlefield or were executed afterwards.
Now it's time for the king's counter-revolution. After the defeat of the barons, the Parliament was held at York, where the ordinances were overturned. The Statute of York both reaffirmed and redefined the king's relation to Parliament. In the act of questioning the barons, the Statute of York solidified Parliament's role as legislature, and that legislation could not come from baronial councils or the king's commissions, and reinforced a traditional view of how government was meant to be, the work of the monarch and the community.
But it also went beyond a return to the 1307 status quo and emphasized that instead of the assent of the community, it was instead the assent of the prelates, earls, barons, and the commonalty of the realm. Wilkinson questions the extent that this was meant to include the commons in the legislative process, as its purpose was to stop the barons from claiming to represent the community as a whole. Like most things in medieval history, the point at which the commons start getting involved in legislating is murky and depends on what parameters you use, just like my height.
As a side note, the Parliament of York was the first time that representatives of the Welsh Commons appeared in Parliament, and as we mentioned in our last episode on medieval Parliament, the knights and burgesses were often sent home early. This was no exception. The Commons left after 3 weeks, and the Magnates stayed for another 6, with Parliament still being regarded as being in session.
During Edward's reign, some representatives of the Commons were summoned to 21 out of 27 parliaments, which is a higher proportion than during the later part of his father's reign. But parliaments are still dominated by the barons, knights, and burgesses when they are present, and are still petitioners who agree to taxation. They are not enmeshed in the baronial political struggles at the time. And now to the deposition of Edward II. Between 1322 and 1326, the king ruled with heavy influence from the Despensers, one of whom he is generally understood to have been in a romantic relationship with. Like Gaveston, go team. The queen became a rival to the king when Despenser advised Edward to seize her estates in September 1324. Spill the tea.
In 1325, Queen Isabella was sent to negotiate with her brother, the King of France. In the negotiation, Charles IV requested that Edward II pledge fealty to his lands in France. This is where he made the mistake of sending Prince Edward on his behalf. The control of the king's heir allowed Isabella and Mortimer, which was Isabella's lover, to plot a coup in 1326. They invaded England with the support of the Count of Chennow, who had married his daughter to the prince. The Spencer proved to be unpopular, and there was an uprising in London, after which the Queen and Mortimer established themselves as regents.
The influence that Parliament had on the deposition shouldn't be overstated. Michael Jones, writing about Edward II's grandson, summarizes the event as, in January 1327, a Parliament was held in the king's absence and the king was forced to abdicate. This gives a misleading impression that Parliament has the power to remove the king or even to meet without him. This is false.
Thompson argues that Queen Isabella and Baron Mortimer did the majority of the work, and that Parliament merely concurred to a fait accompli. And in terms of any parliamentary importance, it was the precedent it served for 1399.
Foreshadowing.
This is probably also an understatement of the influence of Parliament. What happened is somewhere in between. A Parliament was summoned as the institution in which it was decided what would happen next. Negotiations took place between the Queen's faction, backed by the remnants of the Lancastrian faction, against the king. In the end, the king agreed to step down in favour of his son. As the king was not present, the contemporary chronicles disagree as to whether it was a parliamentum or a concilium general cleri et which is a general council of the clergy and people. But every other group that composed parliament was present, and there was seemingly a unanimous agreement that the king had to go.
Nevertheless, this was a constitutional milestone, which we will see later in this episode and throughout the series was used repeatedly with various different levels of legitimacy. And now on to Edward III.
Edward III is a monumental figure in general English history. He is the character that began the 100 Years' War, which lasted 116 years, through his mother's claim, which would see the English and the British monarch claim the title of King of France until the Act of Union in 1801, when Ireland joined the UK as a single state 8 years after the French Republic had been declared.
But what is less well known is how the constitution evolved under his reign, how Parliament developed, and how English started to become the language of government. Whilst the events of the reign of his father and grandson are far more dramatic, the way government developed over these 50 years is too significant to skip over. Whilst it is not new, we should re-emphasize the presence of the king's ministers and even civil servants attending parliaments. The king invited judges, lawyers, officials from the exchequer, and high-level figures from the diplomatic service. Many of these figures helped the king in writing legislation. We even have a specially appointed committee of lawyers which helped to draft the Statute of Northampton in 1328. And now it's time for Samuel's American rant. So sit back, strap in, and enjoy. Take it away, Samuel.
The Statute of Northampton is so important as it influenced another aspect of modern US law, gun control. In New York versus Brewer in 2022, the Supreme Court argued that a law was unconstitutional, which required that individuals have a license to carry a concealed gun in public, and that certain criteria were required to obtain a license, such as being 21 years old, not having been convicted of a serious crime, or not having been involuntarily committed to a mental hospital. This built on D.C. versus Heller in 2008, which essentially invented an individual's right to bear arms, overturning 200 years of US cases which limited the right to gun ownership with membership of a militia, which can be seen in US versus Cruikshank in 1876, Custody, Illinois in 1886, and United States versus Miller in 1939. Part of the part of the minority argument in this case relied partly on the Statute of Northampton, which made it a criminal offence to carry arms without the king's authorization. No man, great nor small, or of what condition whatsoever he be, go nor ride arms by night nor by day in fairs, markets, nor in presence of the justice or other ministers upon pain to forfeit their armour to the king, and their bodies to prison at the king's pleasure. The minority also pointed out that the Statute of Northampton had been in force for centuries, appearing in Blackstone's commentaries in 1769, and it was applied to guns, as can be seen in Sir John Knight's case before the King's Bench in 1686. Now, the majority, which includes Alito and Thomas, were mortal enemies, tried to dismiss this by stating that the law was far too old, being written 200 years before Shakespeare, and didn't reflect or impact the US Constitution. This is entirely hypocritical and a real paper-thin argument, as not only do we know Hamilton read Blackstone when drafting the Federalist Papers, but also this is the exact same set of judges who had literally published the day before a ruling overturning abortion access, partly on a poor interpretation of Braxton, who was writing 80 to 100 years earlier than the Statute of Northampton.
Get owned. And now back to Parliament. The foremost development of Edward's reign is the merging of the various types of attendants into the two Houses of Parliament. Roscoe estimates that it was the beginning of the reign of Edward III when knights, citizens, and burghers began to be called the Commons, and that in 1363 they had their own clerk designated by the king. The role of the Commons throughout Edward's reign was slowly expanding, but it was inconsistent. In 1340, one legislative committee had 12 knights and 6 burgesses, in addition to the magnates and the ministers, but this was unusual.
Spiritual and temporal lords were first merged in 1352 into one chamber, the House of Lords. And I know I translated from medieval French, so forgive me. As secretaries and bishops hold their temporalities of the king in chief, and by so much are stones of the earth, and of our others, counts and barons, which I suppose makes a degree of sense somehow. Over the reign of Edward III, the average size of the House of Lords was 58, ranging from as little as 27 when the king and his retinue were sieging Calais, to as many as 78. Just to put that in context, the upper estimate is a tenth of the size of the current House of Lords.
Parliament was sent reports on the king's movements, although this was more as a press campaign rather than accountability. This suggests that Parliament was meeting in England without the king whilst he was on campaign in France, which he did quite a lot, which is unusual as the previous understandings and the near contemporary modus tendendi parliamentium suggests that the king has to be present. I quote, "The king shall sit in the middle of the larger bench and is bound to be present at prime on the 6th day of Parliament." There was a significant tension between the judges and the commons, as the judges were often slow to read new legislation and would often ignore statutes in their rulings, and the commons were regularly petitioning for rulings made in contradictions of statutes to be overturned.
The Commons also repeatedly requested that Parliament should be held annually, primarily because of its ultimate judicial authority, in cases which were challenged elsewhere on the basis that the king wasn't present. This is important to understand because at this point, while politics and economics are being discussed, the contemporary understanding of Parliament's purpose is that it is a court where petitions of the people are responded to with new statutes and rulings by the king.
For the most part, Edward III restored royal power between 1341 and 1376. He did not allow Parliament to appoint ministers or to challenge his government directly. However, the cost of war with France meant that Parliament was necessary for the raising of funds, and the king did allow in 1340 for Parliament to investigate tax collectors and agreed to allow a baronial committee nominated by Parliament to manage the king's revenue and expenses. In April 1341, the king had to give more parliamentary oversight, where peers had an input in the selection of ministers and gave Parliament power to attaint those ministers. But this arrangement fell apart by the end of the year.
And so now on to the good Parliament. Cue epic music. The Good Parliament of 1376 was held at the end of the reign of Edward III. The Good Parliament is important to the history of the Constitution for two reasons. Firstly, it introduced the office of the Speaker of the House of Commons, and second, it was the first case of the House of Commons directly challenging the government of the King. The National Archives claim that it was the longest sitting session of Parliament up to that point. The Parliament began with Chancellor Sir Thomas Snivet asking for an increase in taxation and an extension on the custom of war.
The context for this parliament is that England had been at war with France for almost 40 years, and taxation had been high for a long time. In addition to grants by parliaments, custom duties had been imposed and increased on wool, wine, and cloth, causing decades of tension between the government and the commons. There had also been a sense of growing corruption in government. A simple example is that the king's mistress's husband was appointed as a lieutenant in Ireland in 1369 and taxed the Irish heavily and illegally. He was recalled in 71, only to be reappointed 3 years later. The sense of dissatisfaction was so great that the government, despite being in need of funds, didn't call a parliament in 1374 or 75, and by 76, the need for financial and judicial powers of Parliament forced the government's hand.
On the 28th of April 1376, Edward III opened Parliament but was very ill, as was the Prince of Wales. So after the opening, chairman of Parliament was passed to the King's next eldest surviving son, John of Gaunt. The Chancellor, in his opening speech, asked for a tenth from the clergy and a 15th from the laity, on the basis that the Truce of Bruges of 1375 would run out within the year and funds were required for the resumption of their hostilities.
Because of this, the Commons was in a rare position of power. They were united in a sense that they had a responsibility to counsel the king, and between April and July, they essentially held the continuation of the war hostage. This Commons met separately from the Lords and the King and debated a number of problems ranging from defence, local government, general administration, requests for annual parliaments, and for sheriffs to be elected rather than appointed by the King.
Commons implemented an oath of secrecy before discussing not whether to grant the taxes, but how the King might pay for the war out of money he already had and other avenues of income. The Commons then elected for the first time a Speaker, Peter de la Mare, to go to the Lords, where Gaunt was seated, and demand the right of the Commons to scrutinise public accounts.
This really was a medieval constitutional Royal Rumble. The Speaker addressed the House of Lords and the John of Gaunt on 9th May. De la Mare stated that the Commons wouldn't approve taxation until several issues of corruption in the King's Court was addressed. The lack of revenue from Calais, that Latimer and Lyon had given loans to the Crown at exceedingly high interest rates and then bought royal debt at discounted prices. The Speaker also raised the issue of the King's mistress Alice Perret being provided with £2,000 to £3,000 a year, which comes to about, in today's money, a lot of money.
This wasn't just an ultimatum. These members of the court and others faced legal charges. Throughout May, the Commons came before Parliament, meaning the Lords, to request and present evidence. And by the beginning of June, Latimer and Lyons were formally put on trial for going beyond their powers to enrich themselves.
The process of impeachment originated in the common law, where a collection of accusers laid a charge in the King's name. The charges were brought by the Commons and tried by the Lords. During this trial, it was revealed by the former Treasurer, Sir Richard Scope, that Latimer and Lyon had given those loans without his knowledge, forcing Gaunt to remove Latimer from office and imprison Lyon, as well as banishing Alice Perret from court. These sentences were later overturned in the following bad Parliament of 1377. But the power of impeachment was reaffirmed a number of times in the following years, 1383, 1386, and 1388. And it goes on to dominate the reign of Richard II, giving the Commons the ability to directly challenge the King's ministers, even though the King himself remained immune from scrutiny.
And Lyon, not related to the minister, also highlights that the good Parliament is the first example of the Commons attempting to influence an unfair succession between Richard Bordeaux, son of the Prince of Wales, and John of Gaunt, the King's eldest surviving son. The question over which descendants of Edward III would hold the throne resonated for the next century and was finally restored in 1487 with the end of the War of the Roses.
Which we get into, but that would be spoilers. And you'll have to catch it in the next episode. Something to really re-emphasize with a good parliament is that not only did the Commons challenge the government for the first time, it did so in a period of national crises, where it could leverage the need of the government to fund a war to challenge a deeply corrupt court.
So now we're going to move on to the reign of Richard II. Edward III died in 1377, leaving the crown to his 9-year-old grandson, who was left under a regent, which led to conflict with his uncles and other councillors over when and how he should receive his powers. And now we shall move on later into his realm, when he's a bit older, to the wonderful and merciless Parliament to be found in 1386 and 1388, respectively. Take it away, Jolla!
In 1385, the king had created a number of titles by giving away his own land, which caused significant economic problems. Just from the land he granted to the new Marquis of Ireland, the crown would lose £45,000. In today's money, that would be 42.25 million, which is also the equivalent of 1.5 parliamentary subsidies. Combined with the other regular payments to the new duchies and earldoms, the king would be bankrupt in 3 years.
During the October 1385 Parliament, the Commons lobbied for reforms. First, that there should be restraints on the king's ability to make grants, meaning to give out money, from revenue, including future windfalls. Second, that an independent body of laws examine the government and the king's finances, or instead of his officers. This was carried out during that Parliament. Perhaps most importantly, no sheriffs, executors, bailiffs, receivers, customs controllers, or weighers were to be appointed except with the advice of the council, and that all port officials, captains of castles, and naval officers would only be appointed by the advice of the King's Council, and all these points were passed in the bill and accepted by the King.
In early 1386, there was also a French invasion scare. John of Gaunt at the time was leading the majority of the English army at Castile, so was very tied down, which led to a wave of crime in the south of England, which destroyed trust in the king's ministers. In the October 1386 wonderful Parliament, the king demanded the payment of 4/15 in tax, whilst also raising the Marquis of Ireland to a duke, which would cost more money and upset the social order, as no one who was not a royal had been a duke before. Absolutely scandalous. Michael de la Pole, the king's best bud at the time, was impeached for not implementing the reforms required by the 1385 Parliament, as king had granted so much money to the new duke that it wiped out the savings made by the reforms over the whole year.
Following his chancellor, Michael de la Pole's impeachment, Richard was forced to accept the appointment of a commission of government, which ruled in his name for a year, which was known as the Lords Appellants. Richard spent a good amount of this time trying to conjugate a legal argument through his judges that impeachment itself was illegal. He gained support from the Chief Justice of Common Pleas and other prominent legal experts, who stated that those who had acted against him while not guilty of treason should be executed if, while acting against him, they had mentioned the deposition of Edward II.
This forced the Lords Appellants in November 1387 to muster troops. After winning a skirmish, they threatened to replace the king with Henry Bolingbroke. One source even suggested that he was deposed for 3 days, but reinstated when Gloucester and Bolingbroke argued over the throne.
In February, Richard summoned Parliament. At this point, the Lords Appellants also created a spurious charge of treason for a number of Richard's ministers and friends, which were argued against by a panel of judges and doctors of civil law. But the Lords declared Parliament to be the ultimate judge and overruled them, assuming the power to try cases of treason from the judges. The Lords broke a number of customs in prosecuting the king's supporters, refusing to grant trial by combat, for instance, or breaking sanctuary, and the judges who supported the king originally were sent into exile in Ireland.
This debacle began the practice of the Bills of Attainder. These would later be introduced by the king and passed by Parliament to declare acts which were not considered treason by the 1352 statute to then be so. This not only stripped someone of their property, but also stopped their children from inheriting. This in practice allowed the crown to seize the property of powerful vassals.
There is a hint in the merciless Parliament of the Lords Appellants arguing for Parliament supremacy, or at least the independence from the common law court. The Lords Appellants tried to make it so that their work could not be undone, and the implication was that if the law was made by Parliament and can be altered by it, so that no one Parliament can bind its successors, then the doctrine of sovereignty of law taught by Bracton falls. Instead of being under the law, the king would be under Parliament.
King Richard in the late 1390s was heading towards a form of absolutism in his government. In 1397, the king arrested and executed Arundel, Warwick, and probably murdered Gloucester. He overturned the acts of the merciless Parliament and was granted custom revenue for life, making himself independent of Parliament for funds. In 1397, despite his view on the wonderful Parliament, the Commons asked permission to, by his leave, impeach anybody as much as they'd like as long as they were present in Parliament. Surprisingly, the king agreed, and the Archbishop of Canterbury was promptly impeached. When John of Gaunt died in February 1399, which we had foreshadowed earlier, Richard seized his estates rather than let them go to Bolingbroke, who at this point was in exile, and his sentence was extended to banishment for life, which set the ball rolling for the end of Richard's reign.
So now on to the deposition of Richard II. In 1397 and 99, Richard is considered a tyrant by contemporary chronicle Thomas of Walsingham, who detailed how Richard demanded forced loans. He even sold blank paper with the king's stamp on it, which could then be written in any sum that this person likes to go and demand money off you. So, that's not exactly a good system for economic growth, is it? The king also started to demand blank sheets with seals on them from various lords, and the king could then write what he liked into them. And he was broadly seen as breaching Magna Carta in the most egregious ways.
Whilst Richard II was on campaign in Ireland, Henry Bolingbroke snuck back in England in July 1399 and was welcomed by a large number of knights who were tired of the king's transgressions. The government in England tried to raise an army in Oxford, but was outflanked when the Midlands declared for Henry, and it was estimated that Richard was so unpopular that Henry might have mustered 100,000 men. Richard returned to England and tried to raise an army in South Wales, but Henry was already in Bristol, and forces allied to Richard started deserting en masse, and by August Henry had de facto control of the country.
The king was forced to summon a parliament for September. This assembly was not quite a parliament, as it was significantly packed with local citizens, but it agreed that the king should be deprived, and then representatives of the peers, the Commons, met with the Chief Justice of the King's Bench, who confirmed that Richard was no longer king. But this left the question of how Henry would ascend. He was discouraged from claiming right of conquest, and this would mean that he wouldn't have to abide by the laws of the people, or challenging the rights of previous kings by suggesting through his maternal great-grandfather that Edward I, Edward II, Edward III, and Richard II were all illegitimate, because that would have caused absolute havoc in the law.
There was also the question of the transfer of power, without having to dismiss and resummon another parliament, as upon Richard's deposition, all acts became illegitimate, as parliament couldn't exist without a king. There is an idea that Henry IV gained his claim from parliament, which is explored by a guy called Laspsley, as he explores what might have happened behind the scenes at the September Parliament. But the official narrative is that Henry claimed the crown from the descent of Henry III, and Parliament promptly agreed. Wilkinson disagrees strongly with the idea that Parliament played a decisive role in the deposition. This is because Parliament was not a separate institution from the Crown, it was the King discussing, treating, and judging with the Commons and the Lords, and that no contemporary would argue that the Commons and the Lords remained a Parliament after Richard was deposed. He is of the opinion that most events of the 14th century did not establish rules. 1376 did not establish ministerial responsibility, and the merciless Parliament didn't create parliamentary sovereignty.
What? I think he is correct that no hard, fast constitutional rules were established, but I think they did establish precedents that allowed later generations to claim ancient rights and privileges and to challenge future kings and governments, especially in the 1600s. He also questions the role of the Commons in the deposition, and as far as Parliament was involved, it was primarily the work of the Lords, considering the risks involved, and the judicial powers that rested the Lords. Wilkinson also argued that the fact that Henry was acclaimed by Parliament, and that he probably appreciated this, did not mean that the Lancastrian claim to the throne was built on Parliament. It was built publicly on support of God and the descent of Henry I. Parliament enhanced the claim, but it was not the claim itself.
That brings us to the end of the episode. And as a little recap, we covered the tumultuous 14th century, although basically every century is tumultuous at this point in English history. Thinking about it, I think it's really hasn't calmed down. But anyway, we hope you have enjoyed our travels through the rebellions, impeachments, depositions, and general chaos as our constitution slowly evolves through history.
Next time, we will look at the Lancastrian Constitution and then thoroughly dismiss it, because Dobbs was very much doing the Victorian and saying and misrepresenting history, as was done with King Arthur, the Vikings, and basically everything else. We will then move on to the way Parliament changed through the 1400s, through the early Tudor period, as to set up for a deep exploration of the 17th century, and that's when everything changes. You've got to be ready. Have a good day, guys.
See you next time.